Good morning on the East Coast. You're watching Cooperative Vermont. We are happy to have with us a guest from across the pond in Britain, Mike Perry of the Plunkett Foundation, doing a lot of work around the conversion of kind of village pubs especially in rural areas into cooperatives. And as folks who've been following Cooperative Vermont know, we've been quite involved in the starting of a consumer cooperative brew pub in our town in Burlington, Vermont, and that's been kind of a growing trend in the United States. So we were thinking it would be interesting to really dig into kind of the experience of what's going on in terms of cooperative drinking establishments in Britain. Eric, you have any other things you want to add at the beginning before we dive in with Mike?
No, I think it'll just be interesting to get a perspective from where the cooperative brew pub idea might be a little more mature. So yeah, I think it'll be a great interview.
So Mike, welcome to the program. Do you want to give us a little bit of your background, how you came to the Plunkett Foundation and what the Plunkett Foundation does?
Okay. Well, my role at Plunkett is head of development and policy. So I've been involved in our pubs work pretty much since the start, about 5 years ago or so. Background to the Plunkett Foundation, we were founded 96 years ago by Sir Horace Plunkett. He was best known for being the pioneer of the cooperative movement in Ireland, primarily responsible for helping set up farmer cooperatives, cooperative creameries, and also cooperative credit institutions in rural areas. And he went on to influence cooperative development all around the world. For example, the rural electric co-ops in the States, in part came from Horace Plunkett, in that he was involved in Theodore Roosevelt's Country Life Commission, which recommended that cooperatives are the best approach for rolling out rural electrification. So our founder's impact is kind of all around the world. But we were founded quite late on in his life in 1919, and our work was to take forward his vision of better living in rural areas through supporting and promoting the development of cooperatives. So we've worked all over the world. The majority of our work at the moment is UK-based, some work in Ireland as well, and also we're doing some work in Western Canada as well with Federated Cooperative. And in 2013 we won the Rochdale Pioneer Award for the International Cooperative Alliance for outstanding contribution to the international cooperative movement. So we've been around a while.
Nice. And so this initiative you have to mutualize these village pubs. Can you talk a little bit about the origins, where that idea came from, what the sort of larger context for why it's on the table and something you guys are putting energy into?
Okay, I'll give you a bit of a background as to how this kind of idea developed in this country. The first cooperative pub actually opened in Wales 25 years ago, just over 25 years ago, celebrated its 25th anniversary last year. But pretty much no one had heard about it. But 10 years ago, or now 11 years ago, a pub in Cumbria, right in the north of England, set up a cooperative pub, which went on to inspire so many others. I think what was really critical there is the people involved, and their chair is now on our board, representing the pub, also cooperative pubs more generally. I think the critical point there is that they made an active effort to reach out and speak to people about what they've done and why they've done it. And their chair, Julian Ross, must have spoken to hundreds and hundreds of communities over the last 10 years, many people each week who are inquiring about what they did, how they did it. So where we got involved was we've been supporting communities to save predominantly village shops for since 2004, since an organisation merged with us in 2004, and we've seen great growth there. There's 334 community-run village shops in the UK, but there are a few years ago there were very few pubs. Really, there were only I think 3 cooperative pubs about 4 years ago, and what we were discussing and have been discussing for some time is that the approach, there's no reason why the approach can work perfectly well for community groups concerned about saving their pubs. And it's probably the same where you guys are, but we're seeing across the UK about 30 pubs closing each and every week. And this has been happening for years, and so many communities that only have one pub. And so we started to do some work around this time 5 years ago. There was quite a bit of political interest. It was just on the lead up to the last general election, and all the parties suddenly woke up to the fact that things like pubs and post offices and shops were really important to people. So we were asked to develop a support programme, which we did by the previous government. Sadly, the election was called shortly afterwards, and the contract was never signed, but the work was still kind of underway, if that makes sense. So we were still supporting groups, and groups were still coming to us. So from that point, we worked with various other organisations to try and get support set up, and we're still really in that phase. We have far more community groups coming to us than the support allows us to support at the level we'd like to support. You know, we're working with actively over 80 groups now, and I was saying to you guys just before this live chat started, we've got a visit for 15 groups tomorrow, just 15 completely new groups visiting Cooperative pubs tomorrow. So this has all really come out of the fact that what we tried to do as Plunkett, and what we did really well with community shops, and we continue to do, is we try and promote cooperatives as a very normal way of communities responding to these issues that so many communities are facing. So, you know, for a number of years now, a community turning to set up a co-op has been the default response to how communities will react to saving their village shop if the village shop closes. There is really no other option there. With pubs, it hasn't been seen in the public domain that this was possible or achievable, and the examples were not known enough by everyday people. And so we've been doing work, as well as supporting groups, we've been doing a lot of work to try and get it into the public domain. So quite a few high-profile TV programs, radio shows, national press, they've carried stories about cooperative pubs over the last few years, and we've seen interest rise in accordance with the level of coverage that we've been receiving. So we really started this work properly in March 2013 when we launched the first line for this. We've been supporting groups kind of ad hoc since before then, but that's when it really started. Within 6 months, it was the highest number of inquiries we were getting for any type of cooperative development support. So straight away. And it's still the same now. We get high numbers of inquiries each and every week from new community groups trying to save their pub. And whilst we're a rural-focused charity, and the majority of our work is focused on rural areas, there are cooperative pubs in London, in the centre of Manchester, a big city in the north of England, in Bath, a smaller city in the southwest of England, and also more recently in a housing estate in a low-income area just outside of a city on the south coast of England as well. So whilst the kind of Save the Last pub in the village has been the driver of most of the interest in this area, we are seeing interest from cities, towns, villages, everything really. And yeah, the opening recently in a housing estate has indicated that it can happen anywhere.
So from the American perspective, our kind of experience with this sort of the institution of the pub or bar, I think has been heavily flavored by, we had a period of prohibition, and then, a period in which the alcohol industry was extremely concentrated and heavily regulated. So we don't have a kind of continuous tradition. So can you talk a little bit about kind of what you see, or what people in Britain sort of see as the role of the pub in the kind of social community life of these towns, and kind of like what is its role that makes it feel important enough that people want to save it using this model?
So the role of pubs in communities here is essentially they are one of the few places of social interaction, and they're the places you meet your friends, your family, your neighbours, and there are very few other places that fulfil that function. And really, people have turned to cooperative because pretty much there's been a tidal wave of closures over many, many years, and people are just completely helpless to do anything about it. And the cooperative approach has been seen by people as a really viable way of looking at this and saying, actually, could we do something about this, because this really matters to us.
And what do you see as driving those closures? Like, are there certain kind of like larger trends in the economy, or what's the sort of force that this is a response to?
I mean, it really depends who you speak to. If you speak to some people in the pub sector, they will say the country is over pubs. There are too many pubs. And if you were to take 10% of them out, then all the others would be viable. We don't really buy that, to be honest. We kind of understand the logic, but we don't really buy it in that many pubs close because they're not run very well. The owners haven't invested in them. They're not providing the services, the beer, the wine, the wider drinks, the food that people want. And that's largely what's really closing pubs. And also the operating model as well. In this country, we have a small number of private companies, mostly private equity companies, that own and run a large number of pubs. And that model has led to a large amount of money going out of the pub to pay off massive debt, essentially. And it means those people who are trying to run pubs are finding what's interesting about pubs is those that have been paid by co-ops we haven't yet seen a closure. We're still only at relatively low numbers, 33. But I've been to pubs, the original one, the old Crown in Cumbria, in the north of England, where people are queuing out of the door during the summer to get in. It's quite a small pub, but this is a small village. People are queuing out of the door. And we went to another one in Yorkshire, again in the north of the country, and we went there on Wednesday to meet an MP, who was until recently our foreign secretary, and he's actually a shareholder in two cooperative pubs. But the pub we went to visit, that he recommended we meet at, it was Wednesday morning, and on Wednesday morning, on a Wednesday lunchtime, there were the need to book tables for lunch. It's that busy again on a Wednesday lunchtime, again in a small village in the middle of nowhere. And so we've seen that it can transform these pubs. These pubs can be really successful. So it's difficult sometimes to take. We still have in this country, we have a smoking ban that came in years ago, many years ago, and people still attribute recent pub closures to the fact that people can no longer smoke in pubs. So we just get a whole range of different reasons.
And one other thing that I think it would be interesting would be to hear the story of you mentioned this kind of very first pub that opened. It's 25 years old now. That started in Wales. What was the story behind, kind of origin story behind that?
Well, I think the more interesting one is actually the old Crown, the one that started 10 years ago that went to inspire others. So I'll talk about that one if that's okay. Mm-hmm. So the kind of story behind that is there was a really kind of iconic landlord that ran the pub, and everyone loved him. Everyone loved what the pub was doing. The guy set up a brewery behind the pub, and everyone loved the beer as well. So he was known for great beer brewed right behind the pub, and also they served curries, really great curries. So they loved it for that as well. And the guy ran the pub for quite a while, and then eventually decided to sort of slow down a bit and wanted to sell the brewery. And the community decided to try and buy it and set up a cooperative to buy it. So the Heskett Newmarket Brewery, and the beer is fantastic, was bought as a cooperative. Then a few years later, the owner of the pub decided he was going to leave the pub and sell the pub. And again, the community, because they'd seen a cooperative working and understood what it was all about, bought the pub. And they had this great photo and this banner hanging from the window upstairs saying, "Under new ownership, ours." And we use that all the time now. We've created our own banner that we give to people who have set up a new community shop or pub. And that phrase, under new ownership, ours, is one people really like. So we've got lots of great photos of people doing that sort of thing. And the pub is a really traditional pub. If you go in, it's got kind of the horse brasses on the wall. It's got beer mats everywhere. It's got tankards above the bar. And so it's a really traditional pub, because what they didn't want to do is the pub turn into something that they didn't want. And so they managed to preserve the pub as the pub, and they managed to expand it slightly as well. And what I think is really fantastic about what they did is they made a conscious effort to raise as much money through the cooperative as possible through the 3-member share issues, in order to give the people running the pub, it's run by a tenant, the best possible chance of running a business. So they had no intention of charging unreasonable rates or high rates and rent to these people. They wanted them to have the best possible opportunity to run a great pub. And it's still operating really successfully now, and the Prince of Wales has been to visit 3 or 4 times, as have others. And the story there kind of doesn't really end there, because they just have gone out and they've spoken at various events of ours. They've gone to speak at other community organisation events, and they've inspired a whole range of others. We've heard about, there's a cooperative natural food store in another city, and their main reason for setting up is they heard the chair of this pub speak at an event, and he's done that and continues to do it. And actually, he's coming tomorrow to this multiple group study visit as well. So he's coming all the way. It's like 250 miles, which is quite a lot for over here. He's coming all that way to talk to those 15 groups.
So, Mike, that's sort of that begs the question: how are these transformations from private ownership to community ownership? How are they organized?
Okay. Well, there's a few things to look at. There can be some real problems with getting pub owners to sell to community groups. This is something we've been working on for a while. Essentially because in most parts of the country, pubs are worth much, much more money as something. There have been real problems getting communities to be able to buy pubs because the owners have been unwilling to sell. So we have campaigned, as have other organisations, for some powers to help communities to save pubs. So what we have in England, it's not in place in the rest of the UK at the moment, of community value, and the highest number of assets registered under this legislation is pubs. There are over 600 registered now, and it's quite new legislation. And what that allows the community is some time. Basically, if the owner of that pub tries to sell, it gives communities up to 6 months to try and develop a plan, raise some funds to purchase it, which isn't anywhere near long enough, but this has issued some protection. In terms of the practicalities of purchasing a pub and running the pub, the main barrier has been typically raising finance. Very few cooperative pubs are taken on as a lease by the community group. The majority, they've basically had to purchase the pub, otherwise the pub would be lost, essentially. So typical purchase prices would be £250,000 to £350,000. Some have been far more, some have been close to £1 million, and some have been far less, around £80,000. I'll not do the dollar conversions because it's all the currency markets are up and down all the time. So the main challenge has been sorting that out, sorting out the purchase price, and often there's been pretty hefty renovation needs as well. So on the purchase price, what we've seen is communities raising the majority of money themselves. The average cooperative pub raises £200,000. The majority of what is needed through what is called a community share issue, which is essentially member share capital. But we have found that there's a gap often, typically £50,000 or around there, where the community can't raise, or the owner wants slightly more than the market valuation. So there's a grant fund starting, £150 million community business grant fund starting in the autumn, called the Power Exchange Trust. So hopefully that can assist with some of that. On the renovation side, we've seen community groups basically use a lot of local labour, so a lot of volunteer time, a lot of people coming in, painting walls, a lot of people repairing bars, local carpenters, local electricians, local builders, and that's meant the renovation costs have been relatively low, despite there being a huge amount of work from the community as well. So the typical time can take about 10 months to, based on our research last year, to complete a transfer to a community group. So it's a long period of time, and some have been much longer than that. But the process is essentially a small group of people that get turned into a larger group of people that get help to form a cooperative that we encourage to get widespread ownership within the community, typically 200 members per cooperative pub. And then everything flows from that, really, whether that's volunteer effort or member share capital.
Another question I have along those lines is the people who actually sort of make up the membership of these pubs. Does it tend to be people who are already kind of the patrons, the regulars, or does there tend to be kind of other groups that that get involved and sort of become more attached to the pub through the process? What is that kind of the sort of building that community of members that's strong enough to actually sort of take on this task? How does that often play out?
Well, the regulars, it isn't normally a big enough group, because often the pub has been not particularly well managed, and so people have stopped going, or the pub may have been closed for a while as well, so people, again, have stopped going. So kind of regular users of the pub definitely form a part of that, but also people who have kind of some historical link to the pub as well, someone who may have lived in the community and they're investors. So we kind of find there's a bit of a kind of onion of members, the core being people who live and work locally, but going outwards from there have been people with some kind of local connections who don't necessarily live locally. And then equally we found some who are kind of issue-based members as well, who have heard about it, think it's a great idea, and decide they can purchase a share for £50 or something like that. But the majority would be fairly local. It wouldn't be necessarily people who've used the pub in the way the pub was always run. It can be people who have got excited about what they've developed as their sort of vision for the pub. So, a good example is this pub on a housing estate in Brighton. The pub had become a real focal point for problems in the community, drug dealing, antisocial behaviour, and they decided there and then they wanted it to be a community hub. So alcohol sales wasn't really their kind of big thing. They're still doing that, but a lot of it is about being a cafe, being a centre for various societies and groups, and things like they do kind of discounted lunches for seniors as well. So all those kind of groups end up feeling some kind of connection to the mission and often become members too. And we do encourage that the membership is as wide as possible. So 200 is the average, but the one I was just citing on the south coast has over 700 members, has more members than any other at the moment.
So one other thing that came up that I found interesting was that first one that 10 years ago, there was a brewing operation and a pub. Is that unique, or because in the United States the sort of the movement to create these cooperative pubs are usually connected to the kind of the craft brew movement. So it's oftentimes people who are home brewing form one constituency, and people who are into co-ops form another constituency, and these are most usually startups rather than conversions. Can you talk about sort of the place or connection of brewing to these sorts of endeavors?
I'm a member of the Campaign for Real Ale in this country, which has been at the forefront for 30 years of promoting brewing, local breweries, more breweries, and all their reports indicate that the sector's in really good health. There's a lot of local breweries up and running, and there are more kind of entering the sector. So because of that, it hasn't been such a big driver, I think, in this country. The people you speak to, definitely local beer and the quality of beer has been a driver for many. But because there's so many breweries kind of everywhere now, people have been less minded to set them up themselves. I think the one in Cumbria has been really interesting, and then another that followed a few years later was located near to a microbrewery, and they talked about a switch over, but that hasn't yet happened. There is another brewery being set up by the Green Man Cooperative Pub in the east of England. So they set up a community-run shop 11 years ago, a Cooperative Pub 1 year ago, and in about 2 months they'll have a brewery up and running as well. They tend to be independent businesses. Even if they are cooperatives, they have some kind of connection, but they are independent businesses. I think a lot of it is awareness and understanding. I think more we see of communities doing this and running breweries. There are, I think, only 3 cooperative privately run breweries in the country, and a few kind of marketing, well, one marketing club I'm aware of small beer producers. So it's still at relatively low levels, but I think interest in that is going to rise as well.
So what sorts of challenges, as you kind of dug further into this work and more groups are coming forward interested in this, what are the sort of barriers that the groups run into, or challenges that they run into and over the course of the process that kind of seem to be patterns?
Yeah, I think the biggest barrier I think people perceive to be the amount of funding that has to be raised, or the share capital that has to be raised to complete a purchase. That's a kind of logical one. But actually, we found the biggest barrier preventing this from happening is actually being unwilling sellers. When we were first starting to do this work, we surveyed some of the groups that were first coming through, and 60% had problems getting a dialogue going with the people who own their pub. And that's still a problem now. You still get vendors, whether that's commercial property sellers or large breweries or large pub companies who just won't return the calls of community groups. And bear in mind, these community groups that have often raised the money required to purchase the pub at a fair market rate, and they just can't get conversations going. So certain powers that I talked about earlier have come in, which have been helpful. They're being reviewed this summer, so we're hopeful of those being strengthened. And also, sometime this year, another issue is being addressed, which I'll talk about briefly. In this country, a pub can be converted into a shop, into an office, or into a restaurant without the need for planning permission. So that can just happen, and a pub can be lost. And in some cases, they can't be converted back without planning permission, slightly strangely. So you can convert it to a restaurant. And what they've agreed to do, the government has agreed to remove these, what are called permitted development rights for pubs that are listed as assets of community value. So the approach we were talking about earlier. So that will mean that a community group, which often leads to a cooperative, is better placed to be able to protect their pub. I think that's going to be really important. The challenges, the planning system, which I've kind of touched on, has been a real issue. And in terms of finance, I think the big problem has been this capital gap, that communities can raise a certain amount from member share capital, but not everything. But we're hopeful that the power to change trust when this is up and running, and grants begin to flow to community groups, that this will provide some assistance with that as well. And I think those are the main barriers. I think the thing to highlight is that we get a lot of calls from communities trying to save various things as cooperatives. And for example, with community shops, only 1 in 5 people that initially look at it actually go through to opening a new community shop. The others find it too difficult, or have given up quite early on, or have faced certain barriers and that have just gone in their way. With pubs, it's around 1 in 15 because of a lot of these issues. So our focus is on helping to address that conversion rate. And those planning issues, strengthening the community rights, as they're called, as well as improving the flow of grant finance to these groups to supplement member share capital. We think if those happen, we'll gradually begin to convert at closer to kind of 1 in 10, then hopefully closer and closer towards about 1 in 5. And that would see the numbers of openings increase quite significantly.
So Mike, in terms of, you mentioned some legislative adjustments and some raising some funding. In terms of what Plunkett is doing policy-wise, I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. Like, what's next?
What's next?
Yeah.
With pubs, I think what's been really interesting. So the UK government, and these powers mostly apply to England, but the UK government has had a big focus on something called the community rights, which is all intended to be around empowering communities, smaller government, more community activity, etc. And what's really interesting is that pubs have just been at the epicenter of all of this, and people have been quite surprised by it, actually. People in government, in that they thought there would be some interest, but they didn't realise it would be quite such a high interest. And so we're finding actually all three main political parties and some of the smaller parties have a big interest in this area because, from their perspective, it's community groups addressing problems themselves, not turning to government. It's solutions that work in the long term, and it's got the kind of feel-good factor. So there's no reason why any political party would do anything other than try and encourage it. Our kind of current focus at the moment is a general election is due on in early May, and so we're working to influence the main party manifestos, which we're doing okay on. We won't necessarily know the results until the manifestos are published, but it's looking pretty positive. So that's a really important area. But we're also working to strengthen the community rights. So what we've been doing, working alongside organisations like CAMRA, the Campaign for Real Ale, has been to call for, and CAMRA, it's worth saying, have been fantastically important in promoting cooperatives to their members. They have 160,000 members, more than any political party in the country. They have a wide membership base everywhere, and so they are people who care about pubs, and so they're people to promote this model too, to at least get out there the fact that these sorts of things exist. So we've been working with them on a few requests for the government. One is to increase this protected period through the legislation from 6 months to 10 months, which 10 months is the average time a community buyout takes. We've called for the removal of permitted development rights, and this is causing pubs to be lost to shops. Some of them actually cooperative retailers, it has to be said, as well, which has led to a few interesting clashes. So that's definitely something that we've been focusing on as well. And we've also called for something which is kind of turned to be a council risk fund. It's for where local authorities who have planning decisions at their control, certain powers at their disposal, don't feel able to use these powers at the moment because their budgets are really constrained, as many are, where you guys are as well, and they're concerned that any things they use that are pro-community will leave them open to compensation from the pub owner or the business trying to take over the pub and run it as something else normally. What we've put forward is the creation of a risk fund that will allow councils to make positive decisions and would protect councils. It would effectively be an insurance or compensation fund. And the reason we propose this is basically councils are saying we want to be doing more to protect the pubs and help communities, but we don't feel able to because we can't cope with £100,000 compensation bill. And the compensation fund came as an idea because when the assets of community value idea first came through, £20 million fund was set up for that because they wanted to alleviate the concerns around registering assets. It was never touched. No council has ever touched that and asked for anything. So we feel that could be set up, which would de-risk some of these issues and would lead to more communities being able to save pubs as cooperatives and would cost nothing. It would just mean it's there as a protection. So those are some of the things we've been calling for. Also, kind of outside of the policy arenas, we've actually been approaching some of the major pub owners to help them to better understand our work. And one of them met with us quite recently, and they've agreed to certain really important areas, actually, which we're following up with them on. One was to include cooperative buyouts within their sales particulars. In other words, to say if you want to consider saving this as a cooperative, why don't you contact the Plunkett Foundation? And equally, they agree to alert us to when to pubs they have identified as ones they're going to close, which would allow us to proactively go to those community groups and say, you'll have heard that the pub owner is planning to close the pub. If you're considering some pub community buyout, we can discuss this with you. So quite a few areas where we're hoping to make some progress in. But there's a lot of political support. That's what's really interesting, from the Prime Minister downwards.
And so one of the things that in the U.S. I think has been really interesting is that our kind of movement, and again, it's kind of more of a startup thing than a conversion thing for the most part.
I lost you for a second.
Okay, yeah. In the U.S. again, we sort of our cooperative pubs movement is really more of a startup than a conversion process.
Yeah.
But one of the things that's been really interesting has been it's often kind of become for us sort of a focal point of kind of larger or a focal point of energy for people who are engaged in larger kind of co-op movement type organizing. So the primary example of really the most successful one in the U.S. is Black Star in Austin, which has like 3,300 members now and does like $3 million business a year. And yeah, and then Austin kind of is one of the few cities that really has a cohesive cooperative business association that cuts across business sectors. So it's got the credit unions and the food co-ops and them sort of talking to each other. So what kind of connection or role do you guys see the cooperative pubs in Britain playing in the kind of life and sort of fortunes of the larger cooperative movement? How does it fit in?
That's an interesting question. We don't really have that many kind of localized cooperative kind of sector meetings. It's the movement is sort of fragmented into different cooperative forms who meet regularly, often nationally. But there's kind of less happening on a local level. We are starting to see people connect up a bit more very locally at a sort of city or town level. So yeah, that's an interesting question in that I think the cooperative movement generally sees cooperative pubs as really exciting. They see it as something that's like, this is a fantastic way of exciting people about co-ops. Because I think people in co-op development are aware that not all co-ops are that exciting to some people. Whereas pubs is a way of kind of opening up a conversation with people who maybe aren't that interested in co-ops. So I think there's been a lot of interest there, but they haven't really acted yet as a focal point. We're trying to get them to connect up a bit more themselves. But yeah, that's an interesting idea. We need to think more about that.
So Mike, the Plunkett Foundation has this work they've done with cooperative stores, and I know you guys are active with sort of agriculture as well. And do you see synergies amongst these different efforts in terms of what the foundation is doing?
Yeah, well, the way we see it is that 80% of that work is common across whatever form of community co-op you're talking about. The remaining 20% is still important, but it's how you run a shop, how you run a pub. But if you get the basics right about how you set up a cooperative pub or any other community cooperative properly, then yeah, there's a lot of synergies there. We've started to set up a membership scheme which includes kind of bulk purchase discounts for community cooperatives, and that was developed initially for community shops. So we developed various discounted products there, but we've expanded that outwards, and we're trying to develop more products that are more suitable to cooperative pubs too. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of synergies there, and I think we would feel that if someone had set up a cooperative pub, they would be able to go and speak to a community group trying to set up a community supported agriculture scheme or a community shop or anything really, and be able to get across 80% of what's important actually. So yeah, we see a lot of common issues really.
So one other thing you brought up earlier that I found interesting was the idea of when these pubs are really being brought together, you've got the members coming in and helping with the painting and fixing the bar and all that. What are the sorts of roles that members really take on in this process of bringing the pub to becoming a cooperative and even sort of in its life as a co-op? Do they tend to have kind of opportunities for kind of member work in addition to the staff of the co-op, or are there certain volunteer opportunities beyond sort of board work? Like, what does that look like? Member engagement look like?
There's a huge amount of member engagement and member activities needed, particularly in the startup phase, because they need to set up a business, they need to acquire the asset. Often there are planning issues around changes to the building perhaps that they want to get through. There's a huge amount of community engagement needed, continually communicating with both members but the wider community as well. So I think for many groups it's a huge amount of work, quite a heavy burden actually on often a small number of people that sit on the committee who often take on the bulk of the work. In terms of their involvement in the day-to-day functions, most have seen it as it's something that about half of cooperative pubs in the UK are run by tenants, a tenancy arrangement, and half are privately employed by the cooperative. But we found that members are quite hands-off actually. They'll definitely make their opinions known and they'll definitely help out with particularly the renovations and getting things up and running. But generally they've seen their role as kind of using the pub, promoting it, encouraging people to use it. We haven't seen a huge amount of kind of staff type of level activities, albeit we're aware that quite a few people have had to step in as volunteers to man the bar when it's needed, or in busy times, or work in the kitchens, or for some that have accommodation, some people need to sleep in the pub to make it legal for people to stay in the accommodation as well. So there's been a few like that, but the majority of times it's been about using it and making use of it and promoting it.
Can you talk a little bit more about what that accommodations piece sounds like? Because that's really interesting.
Yeah, there haven't been many, but some of them are in a kind of are in very remote areas, but they're tourist hotspots really. The tourism economy plays a much stronger role in their local community than in some other areas. So some have got accommodation in order to service that kind of tourist provision, as well as acknowledging the fact that if people stay in cooperative pubs, they're likely to have their breakfast there, probably their dinner there, and sometimes, provide them with packed lunches to go off walking, which is most of the where most of them are based. We've seen some others consider setting up accommodation, but they haven't yet got to it. They focused on getting the pub sorted. Often they've added other services: a shop, a cafe, a post office, a library, allotments. But some have felt that the accommodation is a step too far, almost. But we think it's definitely going to be an area where we're going to see people start to do this. In part to make the pub pay. I think if groups are having to take on loans, significant loans, they're going to have to make use of whatever assets they have there. So if that is accommodation, then I think we'll see more communities using that.
So Mike, you have members, putting in all time and effort to support the conversion and assets as well. How does governance work in the co-op pubs? How does decision making sort of work, especially where they're giving a tenant sort of authority to do a lot of the day-to-day?
Yeah, it's worth saying that the tenancy agreements are really developed to serve the membership of the co-op. So, for example, the original one 10 years ago that we talked a bit about, they have in the tenancy agreement that they have to sell the beer from the brewery behind the pub. That is also a co-op. And also they have to sell curry. This is just one of their things, that they can set out certain restrictions there as to what they can and can't do. Which has been interesting. In terms of the governance, I think I've said the average community shop has 200 members. Typically, they would have about 8 committee. And so, we're aware how.
Sorry, Mike. You cut off. You said that you cut off briefly there. You said that they have 8 committees.
8 committee members on average.
Okay.
And those are people appointed from their membership. So the typical roles of chair, vice chair, treasurer, etc. So that's the kind of formal governance, I guess. Many will have kind of member meetings or volunteer evenings, things like that, or tasting evenings. So those are kind of more kind of informal ways of getting members involved. And also, I think many have acknowledged, which isn't quite directly related to governance, but many have acknowledged that having a static membership is a real concern. And so many have made a more conscious effort, particularly those who've set up more recently, to, when someone is moving to the community, to encourage them to become a shareholder and encourage them to get involved. We've seen really good practice from community-run shops there, where they kind of deliver a little basket of products with a shared certificate to say, this is our shop, it's community-run, welcome to the village. It's a great way to meet people if you wanted to volunteer and get involved. And if you wanted to, you can join us as a member and become a shareholder as well. And that sort of approach has really allowed the membership to be renewed and their kind of volunteer base to be renewed as well, and their committees to be renewed. Because there's nothing worse than, you know, a committee that stayed the same for 15 years. I think they become tired and become exhausted by the responsibilities, and this just allows it to be refreshed. So we've done quite a bit of work encouraging that as well.
So you're talking, yeah, these issues of community engagement are interesting. And one thing I'm wondering is, given that you have sort of a decent pool to draw from, you know, if there are any particularly interesting or innovative practices that come to mind. You know, so for instance, with our project, we've been talking about, you know, having at member meetings vote a homebrew competition where the winner of the homebrew competition has their beer recipe brewed by the brew pub, and, you know, encouraging members to grow hops and then, you know, in their gardens and sell some hops to the co-op is like another way of engaging members. Are there sort of any examples that you can think of, like from the different pubs, of like kind of unique and interesting ways that, you know, they've really sort of, you know, made membership feel more engaging or more real to the members beyond the you know, having the pint at the bar and maybe there being a patronage refund or something like that at the end of the year?
It's a problem for many co-ops. I think some still see the kind of more formalised governance as something they have to do rather than something they want to do. And so sometimes they kind of downplay things like AGMs and get involved in it more formally because they don't really think people would be interested in that. So yeah, more kind of fun ways of doing that. I love the kind of grow the hops kind of competition. That's really great. But yeah, the majority of time it's been, the community engagement's been fairly like not necessarily that exciting, but they've needed to follow a really thorough process, which again isn't necessarily the most exciting. But I think if you're setting something like this up, we've seen a number of cases in other cooperative forms where people haven't engaged widely enough, early enough, and it's come back to bite them, basically. As soon as the community group think they have the endorsement of the community without talking to them. Yeah, I think pretty much what I was saying is the ideas that you've said sound really interesting and really fun, but we haven't seen that much of that. We've seen lots of kind of really thorough community engagement, really kind of good practice, but it hasn't necessarily had the kind of element necessarily. They've often offered booze and food to encourage people to come along and get involved. That's been the tactic people have used. But yeah, more often than not, it's about holding lots of public meetings, holding regular public meetings, holding member events, holding volunteer events. Something more recently in a community shop that I've been involved in, they committed to try and get a shareholder in every street in the village, every little street, every little cul-de-sac, and that's something they achieved, and that was something that was really important to them, because they had people of high incomes in some areas of the village and people in lower incomes in other areas, and they managed to get member shareholders in every street. So yeah, not the most fun necessarily, but people have been doing a really thorough job, I think, of engaging community people.
So, Mike, you guys have been engaged in this program for a little while now. Could you talk about sort of the impacts that you've seen in the communities where you've seen these conversions take place?
Yeah, I think the most obvious is the fact that the pub remains and the range of impacts that produces. There was a recent report from a university that found that the typical social value of a pub in a rural community is about £100,000 per year. So
Wow.
there's a lot of benefits of the pub being retained,
Mm-hmm.
which I think are important to recognise. But I think the thing we find most exciting, I guess, is what it does to a community when they've done this sort of thing. We have a lot of communities here, and there are a lot of communities all around the world that feel disempowered, that feel things are done to them, that feel they can't halt the decline in a whole range of different issues, whether that's their church closing, their local school closing, shops, pubs, etc. And so we've seen when people have done this, it gives them a spring in their step again, and they feel like they can kind of do anything, they can address any issue. So we've been excited by those that have saved their pub and have done other things at the same time. Even though the pub has been a focal point, we've seen quite a few which have co-located a shop, post office, cafe, library into their premises. And also we've seen, like the example I cited earlier, where people, there's a community that saved their shop as a co-op 11 years ago, and then 10 years later saved their pub. And this year has set up a brewery. I think it's just that kind of transformative effect that cooperatives can have on people, where suddenly they realise actually they can do things about things that they care about, which a lot of people don't feel like that. So that's been the biggest benefit, I think, as far as we're concerned. And it's been really exciting in that it's influenced the whole political agenda, disproportionately, actually, in terms of the numbers that are actually open so far. We think there's going to be many hundreds in coming years. But disproportionately, politicians are talking about it, disproportionately, policies are directed towards it. And it's because people see it as a great thing to happen, a great thing that improves communities and demonstrates kind of empowered, confident, capable communities that all governments seem to want to see. Understandably.
So one other question I have is, since you guys have been, fairly both kind of public and successfully at this for a number of years now, have you kind of been contacted by folks who are working on doing this sort of work, really, like in any other countries? Is this model that you guys have been really sort of at the forefront of, sort of spreading either through Europe or in other places, beyond what we've been talking about in the U.S., kind of this kind of nascent brew pub movement?
Yeah, most of the interest has been from the brew pubs. We've been contacted by a few of the states, but yeah, and we've been on various international media, South Korean TV, Australian TV and radio, Irish TV a few times recently as well. So people are hearing about this through kind of occasional pieces in the press and media, but yeah, our efforts have been focused on trying to get the international cooperative movement to better understand this, and again see it as kind of a model that can be promoted to people in their areas as an exciting way to get people interested in co-ops. And it seems to be working, but it's quite early days still. We're testing some stuff out with the European cooperative movement, which could definitely be applied elsewhere. But we do get occasional calls from all around the world, but the majority's been UK at the moment. Excuse me.
So, do you have any? We're just about at our hour mark, but do you have any kind of final thoughts on the nature of this work and kind of where, what your experience has been with it, and kind of where you see, the Plunkett Foundation going in the next few years?
Well, on pubs, I have no doubt at all we'll see 100 pubs run as cooperatives within the next decade. The trend is pretty obvious, and the options in terms of community saving pubs are so few that I think it's inevitable we're going to see quite a few still. If we get certain changes which look relatively likely to the planning system and to some of the support powers and infrastructure in this country, then it could really take off pretty significantly. So yeah, we're in it for the long term. We don't have necessarily one program of funding that helps us to do this. We have to create a kind of patchwork quilt effect to support these groups. But our commitment is long term. We do expect to see interest from other parts of the world. We have regular visitors internationally on some other areas of our work, not so much about pubs, but as this starts to grow, I think we'll see more of. I think something we'd like to do, we have actually tried this and successfully tried to make contact with a few brew pubs and haven't had a reply so far. So that's why I kind of jumped at the chance to link up with you guys. And it'd be great to continue hearing what you guys are doing, the good work that you're doing, because I think we've got as much to learn from what you're doing as you can learn from us. And also, wider than pubs, some things we're looking at now is woodlands as well. We're seeing increasing numbers of woodlands going into cooperative ownership in different forms. So we're about to launch a program to provide some more support there as well. So Plunkett's always about what is impacting on rural areas and how can co-ops provide the solution. So yeah, woodlands are going to be one area, but also public services are going to be cut dramatically whoever wins the next election, particularly transport, some health and social care as well. And so we've got a lot of work to do to help communities prepare for when this happens. And we think cooperatives have a big role to play there as well. So no pressure on us. quite a few things.
Well, thank you for taking the time for joining us. I'm going to stop the broadcast now, and we can chat a little bit.
Okay.
Thanks, Mike.
No problem.